So do you think, you were saying, do you think the heaven and hell thing would be fun to do?
Yep.
Study it?
Fun.
Half of that would be fun, half it might not. That might be worthwhile.
It's like same people, every time I come in here.
Welcome home. There's more in there than most people realize. When you start really, like, breaking it down, you just looking at it, it's not as clear cut as.
Yeah, I got a few books from Free Library last week or the week before.
Not this coming week, but the week and.
There's just on heaven, and it's really interesting, actually.
You know, when y'all talk about 3 days.
Think about how the ancient Jews were thinking about heaven and hell, and how
Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
kind of moving into passages about that.
You get all
especially.
into the new heavens and new earth. A lot of
Not
different
next week,
opinions there.
Yeah, I'm working next Saturday.
You know, what's funny is how many of those books break it up between
The following week.
like Protestant conceptions of heaven and hell, especially hell, not heaven, and then the Catholic conception of hell,
You'll probably put, yeah.
purgatory, things like that.
You'll put us for 4 days, you know, that'll be Friday, Saturday, okay.
We have a $14,000 thing. So much good. That's one of them, $4 grand.
Yeah, one of those big old grill, Dave Klaus grill. Yeah, that's what I call it.
All right, well, we'll get started. We got a little video here at the beginning. Actually, I have 2 clips. Let's see, we want to get to the second one. The second one's actually something that we watched the very first day, a year and a half ago when we started Acts. But anyway, so in the movie clip, it'll be the old guy's Paul and the younger guy's Luke.
Christ has promised these difficult times. You know you will die here and run. Yet you are certain of the truth. I know the one in whom I believe. And I am certain of the joy of where I go. Yes, but I don't see the same conviction on the others, Paul. These men, these women, these children. I cannot fix their faith. You can inspire their faith, just as your letters always have. You want me to write another letter? Time to get the blood flowing. The way is growing. There are men, women, children now that have never met you, that will never meet you. So there must be a handwritten account of these acts. It is for this same reason that I undertook an account of our Lord Jesus Christ for Theophilus, so that he would tell the story of Christ. And now the people must know your story. You risk people looking to me for Christ. Oh, no, it is your certainty that opens the door to Christ. I've never met Christ in the flesh. But the day I heard you preach in Troas, my God, I saw Christ in you. I left my family, my friends, my whole life behind. You will write it in here. What did you say? You will write it here. Yes. I could smuggle the tools in here. It's not like our last visit to Rome. If you were caught with documents coming from this prison, it could mean certain death.
Here's what we watched on the first day.
We cannot repay.
Is that on YouTube or?
Yes, yeah, these are just clips from YouTube, but the movie's available somewhere. It's actually a really good movie, although it suffers from that modern movie affliction, whereas it's all too dark and they all mumble too much.
I was starting to say, Paul didn't lose his hearing in his old age.
I don't know what that is.
I
I'm
have,
not a fan.
I have a theory to that.
Yeah.
The people that make the movies know what they're gonna say, so they hear it. We don't know what they're gonna say, so we don't hear it.
And I also, as far as stuff being really dark, I guess I do understand that, because that's a holdover from whenever we used to have to go to the movie theater, and the whole movie theater is pitch black, and so you can actually see the shadows just fine. But, you know, now we don't go to the movies as much. We just watch it where we watch it. So, this one's a little bit brighter. They have a candle, so.
You can turn on
We cannot repay evil for evil. Evil can only be overcome with good. Well, considering all they've been through, can you really fault their response, Paul? What did you tell them? Love is the only way. And after all you've seen, you still don't believe it. This isn't anything I've seen. My God. This is a world in the grip of evil. This is Nero's circus. It's passionate hate. Blood washing down the street. Widows, orphans starving to death. Babies born with the slightest defect are disposed, dispatched, discarded. This world doesn't know a thing about love. So you would give up on the world when Christ did not give up on us? Why not? No. Why not? Love is the only way. Love that suffers long. Love that is kind. That does not envy, that is not proud. Love that does not dishonor. That does not seek for itself. Love that is not easily angered. Love that rejoices in truth. Love that never delights in evil. Love that protects, trusts, hopes, endures all things. That kind of love. Give me your hand. Do you understand? Write it down.
All right, so there's that. So both of those little clips, they talk about, you know, the first clip, he's talking about writing the book of Acts, and then just that last bit at the end where Paul is telling him to write it down. Like I said, it's a fun movie. I watched it a while back. And he mentioned in that first clip, Paul's telling Luke, he said, this isn't like our first trip to Rome. So the movie is, which I guess we'll get into about 2 weeks from now, or next week or something. You know, there's the story of what happens after the book of Acts, which is very speculative, and there's lots of different traditions and all that. One is, you know, that Paul has a number of other voyages and things like that to Spain and elsewhere. And then returns to and dies in Rome. So that one buys into that he's done a good deal of missionary work between the first time in Rome, where we leave him in Acts, and when that takes place. But anyway, all right, so today we're going to be talking some about that, what Luke and Paul were saying there, especially in that first clip, about writing down the story that we have now. And so it's really interesting to start to think about, and we've touched on it, you know, a number of times over the past year and a half. But the people who are with Paul, on these missionary journeys. I guess we would have talked about that just for the past year, not the year and a half, because we wouldn't have gotten into that for a while. But, you know, the ones who are with him going to the ends of the earth. We've looked at this passage before. It's one of those that, you know, reveals Paul's humanity, but also the need for companionship and friendship and support and encouragement along the way with what he's doing, because as we've seen, there's lots of physical harm, discomfort, whatever you want to say. He spends years in jail, he gets beat and chased out of towns and stoned and all sorts of stuff, right? So it is good to have some friends. And so when he writes to the Corinthians, that's what he's saying. When I came to you, right, I was in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And it's because, of course, he had been jailed and beaten in Philippi very badly. And kept getting chased out of there, chased out of Thessalonica, Berea, all the way down to Athens. And when we talk about Paul and his traveling companions, what's notable about Athens? This is one of those good quizzes.
The center of pagan worship.
Yeah, we have the shrine to the unknown God, and Paul, addresses that. Athens is the only place where Paul goes to preach where he's alone. So this is why when he goes from Athens to Corinth, and he's been beaten pretty badly in Philippi, and this is estimates vary, but probably no more than 6 months later at the most that he's in Athens, and probably maybe closer to half that time when he's in Athens. And so that's why he was beaten in Philippi. He was put in the stocks. The feet were in the stocks. It's really, to us, it's like the stocks are those silly things that your kids get in, to take pictures of, and you're like historic sites, but in real life they would have been quite uncomfortable and actually pretty bad when your feet were in stocks, bad for the rest of your legs. Athens is the only place that he is all alone. Now there's an episode on the third missionary journey, right, where they're leaving, they're kind of on the return journey. They're kind of on that west coast of Turkey, and he tells everybody to take a boat down, and he walks. We talked about that last semester, or Scott talked about that, so it's been a while since we read that. But he doesn't, it seems like he just wanted to take a walk by himself. Who knows? Who knows what he did on the way? But he tells the rest of the gang to sail on a little ways, and then he walks and meets them there. But Athens is the only place where he's alone. Everywhere else he has people with him. And they don't always get named, and we get weird tidbits of information here and there to try to piece together who is with him in different places. But these were not solo trips that he took. These are trips that he needed support on, wanted support on. If you look at a number of the epistles, I mean, they're even, then they're written. 1 Corinthians, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes. Like Sosthenes is listed as a co-author. 2 Corinthians is the same thing. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the church, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, even some of the things he writes, he's writing it as if it's from him and Timothy or Sosthenes, and he does that a couple times in his writing. So, he wasn't alone. And so some of the kinds of things that he's writing about, and some of these are familiar. I want to kind of look at how some of these play out in real life for Paul. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And he actually, that gets explained a little bit in Galatians. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. There should be a T right there. Therefore, encourage one another, build one another up, just as you are doing. And so he's saying to love someone and fulfill the law. He's talking about, bear one another's burdens, love each other, and that is fulfilling the law. That's a fairly kind of nebulous idea of what the law of God is, right? If we think about what some of the Pharisees and temple leaders would say about the cleanliness rituals and purification rituals and things like that, you're fulfilling the law if you're bearing one of those burdens, if you're loving each other. Therefore, encourage one another, build one another up, just as you are doing. And he writes about this. And I don't think he's writing about it hypothetically or theoretically, people ought to encourage each other. I think he's writing about it because he's lived it. And he knows that sometimes he is the encourager and sometimes he needs encouragement. And in those two clips that we watched, you see both of that. Luke is telling him during that first one, it's like, your letters have encouraged so many people. You've been, people need to know your story too. They need the book of Acts. But then also Luke there is an encouragement to Paul. 2 Corinthians, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And we looked at that not too very long ago. Right? I mean, this is God comforts us so that we can comfort other people. I mean, that's what he says, so that we may be able to do the same for other people. And so this is something that is not just a glancing mention that happens one time or something in the New Testament, and these are all just the writings of Paul even. I think Colossians, we get that expanded out a little bit, right? For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ. For though I am absent in body, yet I am with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and the firmness of your faith in Christ. So this encouragement goes beyond actual, like, here we are face to face. And so you think about the letters that Paul writes. And how these people are spreading the gospel and telling the story. And so this idea of the community of believers is important. Paul writes about it, but we also see it. We got to read between the lines sometimes in Acts. Not all the time. Sometimes it's right there in front of us. Sometimes we kind of have to read between the lines to try to understand just how extensive this little network of believers and friends and co-workers was. All right, so again, this is from a long time ago now. A couple of these slides. Luke himself is one of these people that we're talking about, Paul's traveling companions. And let's talk about how Luke is putting together what he's done. And so the beginning of the gospel says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. And then he starts Acts, he follows that up. In the first book, O Theophilus, the first book is the Gospel of Luke. I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day that he was taken up. Then he kind of goes from there. We get a little bit less of an introduction. But, what does he say here? Many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So by the time Luke is writing, he's not the first. And many, I looked at the little, what's it called? The not the U version. Yeah, the U version, right? Where you can look at all the, they all translate many the same way. It's all many. That's not like some weird, the ESV didn't go, way off the reservation here. So a lot of people. He doesn't just say like maybe Matthew or Luke or Matthew or Mark. Many have. And that's when he writes the gospel. It's even before Acts. And so this is why he's doing this. I'm going to write an orderly account, another one. And why are they doing it? Well, we'll look at a quote about this a little bit later. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So by the time Luke writes Acts, and we don't know exactly when that happens. The real debate about Acts, the speculation, is whether or not it's before or after AD 70, which is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, the destruction of the temple. And there is one line of thinking that says, actually not in Acts, but in the Gospel of Luke, there are some lines that Jesus says about the destruction of the temple and things like that. And so some people think that that's proof that he wrote it after, because he's kind of using some of what Jesus said about that. But he doesn't really, he writes Acts after Luke. We know that. And it just seems like if it had already happened, I know he's writing a narrative of what would have happened before that, but so there's just debate about that. What we've been talking about the past few weeks is, Voyage to Rome and whatnot by Paul, is right about the year 60. 60, not 16, 60 AD. So at some point, give or take a decade or two or something, this gets written down. Why? By the AD 60 or AD 70 or even after that, who from the beginning were eyewitnesses? That was about 30 AD. So, Paul's here on his way to Rome about 30 years after the crucifixion. So some of these eyewitnesses are starting to get long in the tooth, so to speak, right? Some have already been martyred. So to preserve the eyewitness accounts, the people who actually walked with Jesus, we need to start writing this stuff down, because these people they're getting old. They're going to die soon. They're being martyred or whatever, and the gospel is just spreading to the point that you got a rather set number of people. They just can't get everywhere all the time. We see how hard travel is on Paul. So it's really kind of interesting to put Luke into that kind of perspective. This is anonymous. Luke never actually identifies himself, although when we put together some of what Paul says about who's with him in some of his epistles, and we look at those passages that use the word we in Acts, which we'll see here in a minute, we can figure that out. Like I said, the attribution of Luke and Acts to Luke has been like incredibly controversial for a long, long time. Now, some people will say that, Luke's, the way that things were composed and passed down in writing back then, what people added to it after the fact, that certainly is a textual criticism debate that's happened. But as far as just Luke being this person, is fairly accepted. Here's this one book. One reason the Gospels were written was to maintain this accessibility and function of the eyewitnesses beyond their lifetimes. So Luke and people had to write this down because the eyewitnesses were going to die off. It kind of makes sense, right? And so we don't have a lot. The Gospels come well after Paul starts writing his letters. Paul's not writing his letters to maintain eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. If you think about Galatians and the Corinthian letters, he talks about Jesus, always about Jesus, but it's not an account of Jesus. It's talking about issues at those churches. The gospel writers come along a little bit later and start to actually write down the life of Jesus. And then after that, Luke writes down the book of Acts to get this stuff recorded kind of for posterity's sake. They probably had no idea posterity meant us 2,000 years later. There's not a lot of, well, we'll look at some. But there's not a lot of sense in a lot of Paul's letters that they're so immediate and they're so relevant to his audience. You know, the church that he's writing to. Here are the problems you're having in your church. Here's how we can deal with that. Here's how Jesus talked about that. When we read the Gospels, they seem far more broadly appealing, right? They're not just talking about one issue. You'd say, Luke was perhaps writing to a more Gentile audience, and Matthew was writing to a more Jewish audience, which is fine. But as far as like addressing specific things, it doesn't do it. It just tells the life of Jesus, right? So it's kind of this sense that this is for everyone going forward. Whereas some of Paul's writings, and he tells people, look, it's a party. He tells people to share the letters he writes. But there's a different tone in there, maybe different expectations about how the importance of these things. So again, Luke was one of Paul's companions. He talks about him in several places. Sometimes with listing with other people. Think about that. It's actually in one of these. I forget which one. Where we figure out that Luke is probably a Gentile because Paul lists. He says something like the other men of circumcision who are with me greet you, and also Luke greets you. Like, well, why would he not be included with this generic, all the Jews who are with me? So one of the reasons that we probably think that Luke was not Jewish. We've talked about the we passages that we get. There's kind of two long sections. During the second missionary journey, it seems that Luke meets up as they're crossing from Turkey over into Greece. That Luke meets up with them, with Paul, travels with them. And then again on the third missionary journey, the story behind that, or the supposition, I guess, by a lot of people, is that Luke stays in Philippi on the return journey of the second missionary trip. Luke stays in Philippi, or Luke goes to Philippi. Paul goes over to Ephesus. And then when Paul comes back on the third journey and crosses over into Philippi, that's when he meets back up with Luke, because that's when all the we passages start up again. So that's... these are also, all these we passages, us, Paul and us, also are one of those frustratingly, compelling pieces of evidence about when Luke was actually writing. Is he writing in real time? And you were talking about that last week. You have a shipwreck, and I guess you get your little journal, you shove it down your shirt when you jump all overboard, and you realize this is the history of the church. I got to save this.
He was using a recorder.
Waterproof. Put it in a Ziploc bag like we do our phones in the rain. Or was he going back after the fact, like in that movie, the clip that we just watched, where in that one, Paul is back in prison in Rome, long after the fact of the three missionary journeys that we know of. And then that's when Luke writes it down. And we don't know. I mean, we just don't know when he was recording everything. But some of the breaking off between this happened, then we did this, makes it seem like that. He might have been writing some of this as he was, traveling with Paul and talking to all these people. Who knows? We don't know. All right, so on the first missionary trip, we actually don't have a big entourage. We've got Saul and Barnabas and John Mark. And John Mark leads them. As soon as they go from Cyprus, they get up into Turkey, and then John Mark's out of there. And we don't know why, but we know that Paul's mad about it later, and that's why there's the breakup between him and Barnabas for the second missionary trip. So Barnabas and John Mark go their way, and Paul gets Silas. It's all, once they get to Cyprus, that's when in the narrative of Acts, after Sergius Paulus is converted, the next verse, 2 verses later, and from thereafter, Saul is referred to as Paul. And so you think, well, if you had this really important, he was a proconsul, so he was a person of money, person of importance. Paul stays with him, and if he converts, it wouldn't have been, outlandish for someone to kind of take the name of that person. We don't know that. Paul is also just a more kind of Hellenist version of Saul for a lot of people. So, but that's when it happens in the narrative. They convert him, and all of a sudden he's Paul instead of Saul. So only 3 people on the first journey. Second journey sets up some pretty important people because we have Paul and Silas start. They pick up Timothy when they get here in Galatia, like Derbe, Lystra. Well, one of those. Right, they pick up Timothy, and then Luke joins them up in Troas right before they cross over. So, and then Timothy becomes important. He gets mentioned quite a few times by Paul and mentioned in Acts. And then, of course, Luke. Pretty important that he met up with Paul.
One thing interesting about that map is that on the last leg of that journey, going back to Jerusalem, that's a long voyage across the Mediterranean. And how those sailors were able to do that with no modern navigation is amazing, because in the daytime, you wouldn't have anything but just the sun. In the nighttime, you got the stars, but still, when you land over in Palestine, if you were able to hit the fort you were going to, that would be pretty amazing.
Yeah. No, it's impressive. And you got to think some of these sailors probably, they were doing these runs it's like every year I sail from here to here and here to here. So maybe they, you apprentice, you grow up doing it. Maybe you just kind of learn the right times of years.
You look around you, it all looks the same.
Oh, yeah.
You have to have some way to know exactly what direction you want to go.
I would like that.
In different times of the year, you got different, the sun's in different positions, the stars are in different positions.
Yeah. I got nothing for you on that. Well, but Paul, we know, had multiple shipwrecks. And, he sails around a lot, but there are people who sail a lot more than Paul. Other people that are prophetic, that's what they do. They're sailors. And so, was Paul just the most unlucky person on a boat that ever lived? Or were all these people just crashing boats left and right? If Paul's the example, then you're just kind of like, it's like a coin flip, whether or not you're going to make it where you're going, right? And that's also, talk about why John Mark might have left. That's one of those speculations. We know from one of the Corinthian letters, right, that Paul had 3 shipwrecks, and then we know the 4th later at Malta. 3 is a lot to fit in this time frame. So maybe there was some kind of something going on, and John Mark was, I'm out of here. Of course, he had to take a ship back, so I don't know. But that's one of those things people speculate about, right? When you start to read some of these commentaries, like, well, this could have happened. They also probably, I doubt it was quite that straight, right? Surely there's sure they didn't come straight into Caesarea. They might have come up here and think, oh, we got to turn. I don't know. I don't know anything about that whole life. Or imagine most of us don't. The third missionary journey, we get a whole lot more people who are actually involved in the trip. We don't get anyone mentioned at the beginning. We know some of these people they must have been with Paul at the beginning. But, that real quick transition from the second to the third missionary journey, it goes to Jerusalem after the second, and he goes up to Antioch, and then, verses like, and then then he went up into Galatia, and you're like, oh, well, that's the beginning of the whole missionary trip. But most people aren't mentioned until he gets to Ephesus. And then we start to get this longer list of people at different points during that long third missionary. He spends a couple of years in Ephesus, and then comes back that same way. And we also have that strange verse about how he may have gone up further into Greece, that nothing is written about except he mentions it in one of his letters. Manasseh isn't until they get to the very end of the third missionary trip. But he picks up a lot of these people, and they're from all over the place. And even if the second missionary journey, Barnabas and Paul, or Saul, when they start, or Antioch, at the Antioch church, Silas, for the second missionary journey, is Jerusalem. So, Paul is kind of drawing from believers from lots of different areas. Timothy is up here, and he's with Paul for a long time. Once he finally meets up with him on his second trip, kind of stays in that circle. So we've got people from everywhere, which probably was pretty good because Paul used these people for different things, right? He sends some people ahead of him at times. On this third trip, he uses some of these people as letter carriers and messengers. So probably good to have people that know different areas, that kind of know different cultures. In our minds, we kind of see those generic children's Bible illustrations of different places in Bible times, and they all kind of look generically the same until they're in Rome, and then it looks very Roman, but everything else is just kind of old. And that's not the way. These are wildly different cultures, all over the place. Travel was not as easy as it is now. We've talked a lot about that. So, it was easy you didn't just have a homogenous culture across the entirety of Turkey or Greece. And then, of course, when he goes to Rome, he's with Luke. We get some of these we verses. And then Aristarchus, who we also saw a second ago on the third missionary trip. So even when he goes to Rome, he is accompanied by people in that circle that he worked with. All right, and so we have some verses that talk about exactly why some of these people are so important. Use KJV because I was looking at it, it said the grass withereth, and I could not resist. Withereth. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but not the word of our God but the word of our God shall stand forever. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven. Of course, John, we know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in Matthew, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. And that's powerful, right? Heaven and earth will pass away. There's going to come a time where we're all dust, right? But the Word of God will not. It's been around forever. Remains in heaven forever. And while the grass withereth, the words don't. This is, theoretical. This is, the Word of God is forever, right? But in a very practical sense, this is why some of these companions are so important. People like Luke. Because they disseminate the Word of God to the church. And they copy these letters, and they read these letters to other places. And so, how, the kind of highfalutin, high theory ideas about the Word of God lasting forever, that actually plays out on earth with real people, writing stuff by hand and walking it or sailing on a ship to get it from one place to another, so that people can read it and share it with other people. This is great, but it really came down to a relatively small group of people that Paul was working with. It's a lot of you. It's kind of hard for us to keep up with, and I can't keep any of them straight in my mind. But you're not talking about just this. It's not the U.S. Postal Service where you have tens of thousands of postal workers everywhere. It's just kind of a couple handfuls of people. Let's get through a couple of these. This is what Paul writes in a couple of his letters. I put you under oath before the Lord to have this letter read to all the brothers. That's kind of big. He doesn't want anyone keeping this to themselves. I put you under oath before the Lord. He's writing this to someone. It's not like he's asking someone, do you agree to this? You get Paul's letter, it says, by the way, I have put you under oath before God that you will read this to other people. So I imagine if that's most people, they immediately call a meeting and read the letter. Colossians says that when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. What's interesting about that? This is well before. That's not the letter in Revelation. I mean, it's like at the beginning of Luke when the gospel, when he says, you know, all those other people have been writing accounts of Jesus. I'm going to write one too. We don't have all those other accounts. We know that there was a letter to Laodicea.
Well, he had to write tons and tons of letters, they had a lot of time.
And in which book is it that he actually tells? Is it it's in Timothy, right? Where he says, "Don't forget to bring the parchments," which are letters. I mean, it probably wasn't blank paper. I mean, that wasn't too hard to come by. It cost money, but it probably meant letters themselves, things that had already been written. Yeah. So I mean, some of these things lost to time until you dig up the Dead Sea Scrolls or something like that. Indiana Jones digging up the Ark of the Covenant. You know, dig up the letter to the Laodiceans. We have different people that he uses, his letter carriers. The plausible or likely carriers. Some people disagree about some of this. Fairly, you know, Phoebe taking the letter to the Romans and Epaphroditus taking it to the Philippians. They both get talked about in those letters. So there's, you know, there's some good confidence about a few of these. Others a little bit more up in the air. But there's some trust here between Paul and whoever he puts that letter into someone's hand, right? He's saying, hey, get this letter to Ephesus or wherever. And of course, it's on the third missionary journey, of course, right where he gets to Ephesus or Troas or Philippi or someone. He's upset because Titus isn't there. He has sent Titus, you know, he's wanting letters passed, and I think it's when he gets, it's somewhere on that journey. Titus isn't there, and he mentions it in one of his epistles. You know, sad not to see Titus, but then he meets back, then he finally does see him later on in the journey. But you got to think, I mean, Epaphroditus, take this letter to the Philippians, and I'll just see you when I see you. Like, you know, come back here, but I mean, these are long trips on foot. All sorts of misfortune happens all the time, at least to Paul. So, I mean, some of this is, you know, I don't know. I can't get the read receipt on the email as soon as you get this letter handed off to the Ephesians, right? I mean, it's just take it and go. But it wasn't just Paul. And Paul obviously is the quarterback of the team, right? He's writing these letters and he's sending these people off. But he needs these other people. I mean, it's that community. When Paul talks about encouraging one another, working with one another, you know, some of those passages we read at the beginning, I mean, this is what he's talking about, right? It's a communal effort on Paul's part. We know Paul's name, right? Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles. Good grief, I was about to say the Hebrews. Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles, but it wasn't just Paul. I mean, he was the only apostle to the Gentiles, right? I mean, we know why we say that, but he had his team, and he needed them. Here, this is interesting. This put up here for a reason. So we've talked some about some of the hard facts, dig out of the sand kind of stuff that, like, we can really use to date certain moments in Acts, and you know, we've looked at a few of these, you know, kicking the Jews out of Rome and things like that. The things that the Romans do, we have more proof of than the things that the Jews and the early Christians do, aside from the evidence of the Scripture. But, and I love this. This is one of those, because when we talk about these letters as being proof of what they claim to be proof of, we have so many ancient manuscripts and letters, copies of the Gospels and the epistles. And so these dots all represent, some of them represent groups, some of them represent individual manuscripts from ancient times. So we're only getting up to the 300s right here. And so you have the autograph, which is the original. We don't have any originals of any book of the Bible. We don't have anything in Paul's hand. But we start to have stuff really early on. One of the coolest things in the British Library in London, They have, kind of a public museum part of it. And we have the oldest extant copy of the New Testament, and it's portions of the Gospel of John. And it's just fragments. It's not like the whole thing is all neat, crisp, and clean. But you have portions of it, it's behind glass, and it's got all the stuff to try to preserve it. You want to preserve it, go stick it back in the sand in the Middle East, last over 1,000 years. But we don't want to look at it. And so, the way it goes, here's that I copied from Paul's hand, or from Luke's hand, or from Matthew's hand, and then people copy mine, and then somebody copied that person, somebody copied that person's, and you have mistakes made along the way, and variations, and people add to it, take away from it, and so, if Trent writes the original, and I'm copying Trent's, and I get real tired one night, and I start missing a few words and a few lines, one of the copies I make 3 copies, and one isn't as good as the other, but oh well. I send those on, and the bad one, gets over here, and you say, this is really good. I need to copy this, and other people need to see it. You copy it, and you include my mistakes, because you're very studious. And you do it exactly as I did it, but I made a mistake. Then that goes on to other people, and so those mistakes, and sometimes it's just misspelled words, or omission of words, things like that, and then people try to fix it. The next person gets it and says, I don't think this is quite right. Let me fix that. And so all that happens. And that's what the people who put together, our versions of the Bible have to deal with, are variations in the text. Some are obviously, when I'm typing, I spell it's H-T-E instead of T-H-E. I do that all the time when I type, right? It's just a keystroke. Some it's like that. It's obvious what the mistake is. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes, does he really mean this? Sometimes it's whatever. And so we have all that to say, and these are those different areas where those come from, which doesn't really matter. We have tons of copies from antiquity, from the ancient world, of the Gospels and the Epistles, and the Old Testament too. Way more than we have for most other ancient writings. And these are just some examples that were in that. So Thucydides, important Greek writer. We have 8 extant manuscripts. So the earliest one is from 900 AD. Like well over 1,000 years since he wrote it. And the earliest one we have is 900 AD. The writings of Julius Caesar, 900 years after Caesar's time, and we only have 9 or 10 of them. If you look at the ancient Greek playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, Agamemnon and Medea, all those plays, a lot of those guys, we have, one from, 300 years after one of them lives. And that's the copy we have. You go to the bookstore, or I teach some of these things, that's what my students read. And that's what we're basing the text on. The New Testament, we have 1,000 times more confidence that the New Testament is accurate to what the original person wrote than we do Julius Caesar or Thucydides or Tacitus or Aeschylus or Sophocles, because we just don't have that many of their writings from the ancient world. New Testament we have plenty. Why do we have plenty? Because of this little group of people that Paul sent out and the people that followed them. Because they did this. Because they were copying these letters and spreading these letters to other people. We get glimpses of how this happens. This is the end of the Gospel of John, the very end of it. John's talking, it says, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, and we all kind of know that's John, right? How do we know that? We got to figure it out. If I'm writing this, it'd be kind of, how do I refer to myself? I mean, John was right there. Here's inner circle, Peter, James, and John. So you can kind of come up with a way to say that makes sense. But Peter's asking, what about this man? The man who Jesus loved. And then we have this weird verse. And so Jesus answers Peter, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. We know it. Now there are many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. This is an insertion of, not Paul's inner circle, but John's. As John's writing this. John's writing about himself here. And the book of John's written actually later than the other Gospels. John's writing about himself here. And then his little group of people, the same way Paul had his, Timothy and Luke and all, John had his disciples, if we want to call them that. And they just kind of chime in. It's like, in parentheses, right? It's like, hey, by the way, the disciple who's bearing witness about these things, this is him. Like, that's who he's at. He's talking about himself. And we know that his testimony is true. It's the strangest thing. It's just like, it's like if you were writing, the great American novel and, close to the end, you hand it to, your spouse and it says, yeah, no, this really is, he's right. He didn't use AI at all, I promise. Nobody wrote it but my dear husband or my dear wife. And then you just go on. And then we're back to John writing, I suppose. This is a strange insertion, but it's a glimpse of how this happened. This group of people that would have been part of the process. Helping John to remember, telling, maybe running ideas by him. Hey, don't say it that way. Make it sound better than that. Come on, it's Jesus you're talking about, right? Or whatever. It's too long, John. Pare it down. Nobody understands what you're saying anyway. In the beginning was, what is all this? First John, what's
I
that?
was just thinking, like, not only are these different renditions or the copies of autographs, it's like we also have translations in different languages of like the fifth copy.
Yeah.
It's crazy how we've settled on, and you have a canon, and how we have the Bible is just crazy.
Yeah, and that's what we've talked about. A lot of the quotes we get in the Gospels and in Acts of the prophets and the law are quotes from the Septuagint, which was the popular copy they were using. But of course, we now have ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament, books of the New Testament, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, that predate the Septuagint. And so we think those are probably more accurate to what some of those prophets and Moses, what they were actually writing. But that's not what Jesus was quoting. Jesus was quoting the Septuagint, which we think actually has maybe some mistakes. But Jesus was quoting it. So it's like, well, do we go with the one that Jesus was using? Because part of me says, yes, let's go with that. If Jesus wants to quote it, I'm going with that. But we actually think we have a better version of the Old Testament. And that's what we have. None of us use the Septuagint. I don't think. I'll be very impressed if you had your copy of the Septuagint there. So once translation gets into it, it's even more messy. That also shows, it shows the power of God in the process. The Septuagint is a reliable copy of the Law and the Prophets. How do we know it's reliable? Because Jesus and the apostles and Paul quote from it. So I think it's all right? Even though we think we can go back and correct it, we can make it a little bit more precise. And in some ways, some of those changes really make you think. But none of it from the Old Testament, none of those changes point to somewhere besides Jesus. It's not like Septuagint's, doing anything except pointing to Jesus, right? And in pretty much the same way. But it's just really interesting to think about how we actually got this thing in our hand. Anyway, all right. That's probably about enough. We're out of time, so. Next week, we finish up. We finish up Acts. We don't finish up the class. There's another week after that, but we finish up the actual narrative. Pick a little diversion this week.
No.
I think I'm gonna do this for next week. We only have 7 people.
Yeah, no. You were cursing on this week. I have to try to stretch out.
I just didn't know if you wanted to.
Because it's saying that, I guess.
What are you gonna do for
this? Blake has the last one, and it's just kind of a.
All different kinds of media. But I'd like to show her something. I think she'd see some interest.
Well, I read it again this morning.
I've collected from around the world.
If you want to talk about your own theories about what happened.
Yeah, okay.
That'd be a good way to do it. 'Cause, I mean,
So let me go through the text real quick, highlight some things.
unless you find a line in the text to really.
Well, there's a lot, I mean, it goes that old passage from, let's say, you can talk about, what is it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you're running out of room with that,
Yeah.
feel free to talk. And if you don't that week, then Blake can the next week. That would be probably a good thing to cover. That's really what you want, but if you want to there's a lot there.
That's
Yeah,
the hardest
so
one I've ever been.
If you're anxious to
But like.
cover more ground instead of trying to
Move around town.
squeeze the board thing out of those few birds.